Welcome to the Hub and Spoken podcast series, the original podcast for business and data leaders interested in the mindset, approaches, and best practice for delivering insane amounts of value from data and analytics. My aim is to make the topic exciting, inspiring, and importantly, that you learn something from every episode. We explore how organizations of today are approaching the topic of data and the considerations for getting things done, from culture to leadership, from technology to building data products, and everything in between. I'm your host, Jason Foster, founder and CEO at Cynozure, the CDO Hub, and the author of the best-selling book, Data Means Business. In this podcast series, I interview brilliant people from industry who are working at delivering value from data day in, day out, and share my own views, experiences, and frameworks for success. I'm so pleased to bring you this show and hope you enjoy every minute. Don't forget to check out our website at hubandspoken.com. There you can listen to all the previous and future episodes, read the blogs related to the discussions, and subscribe to our newsletter. We hope you enjoy the show. Hi everyone, welcome back along to the show. Today I have with me Mike Hyde. Mike is the Chief Data Officer at Trainline. And Mike's in to talk to us about using data and artificial intelligence to modernise the experience of rail travel. And I'm very excited to have Mike here. I've known Mike for a little while, good few years, I should say. And great to have you on the show and have you here with us, Mike.
Hi, Jason. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So we've known each other for a little while, actually, from probably 2016, I think. I actually think I met you the first year I set up Cynozure, the company. So, yeah, on and off throughout those years. But good to have you on the show. And yeah, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone else?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently the Chief Data Officer for Trainline in the UK, which we're going to talk a bit more about. But before then, I've spent the last sort of 10 years or so in different technology companies, basically running data teams of different sizes and working out how that works. So prior to Trainline, I was at Facebook and ran all of the data science, data engineering teams for the UK. That was a lot of fun. Also involved with starting up the workplace product there. That was pretty interesting. So that was a great experience, a bit like running a startup inside a big organization. But that was a lot of fun. Lots of, exponential growth that happened during those years. That was sort of the last kind of 5 or so before Trainline. And then before that, I was at Skype, where I was running the data science, data engineering teams and sort of built up that capability at Skype Consumer. And then after that got integrated into Microsoft, then I ended up doing the same thing for Skype for Business, which then became part of Office. So I sort of ended up doing, both B2B and B2C apps and really, over that period, really evolving what it means to be a data team inside of a technology company and really working out how data science, data engineering, and increasingly now, the more advanced stuff is actually, can contribute to a technology product in a modern way. So yeah, it's been a great learning experience. I'm still learning like everyone else, still developing, trying out new things all the time, which is, great fun.
Well, you've done it in some great places to learn. And of course, you work with a friend of mine, ex-colleague and friend, Mike Whiteleg at Facebook, I believe. Yes. And also a couple of ex-colleagues from M&S as well. So, right. Worlds have collided a few times. But I mean,
small world.
Yeah, it is a small world always. Microsoft, Skype, Microsoft, Facebook, Trainline. Is there kind of a commonality of experience then that you've had across that, or has it all been, really different? And actually it's a little bit like learning from scratch each time, or actually have you been able to kind of craft and build on what you've done before?
Yeah, I think there is a set of crafting and building. I was going to say before then, I did about 10 years in sort of management consulting, back in that really started from the very early 2000s, before data science or even a career in data was a meaningful thing, and I came at this from a really pragmatic space. Now a lot of people are entering the industry with data science and machine learning degrees, but none of that really existed back in the 90s when I graduated. So I started off, I got into business consulting and I knew how to do, physics and engineering and maths from my education. And so along with a couple of colleagues who had a similar background and ended up in business consulting, we just ended up trying to solve business problems using math. It was just a really pragmatic approach. I remember our very first project was for Orange mobile phones, which I'm not sure it even exists anymore, but
no,
Orange mobile phones was up in the northeast, and they were trying to restructure their call center. So it was a big, complicated project. So there were thousands of people answering the phones. And so we basically built a mathematical model of what it would look like to transform this call center and basically simulate all the calls arriving and just simulate the operations of the call center and then try out lots of different scenarios against it. And that was sort of how it started, really, because I suddenly realized, wow, you can actually solve real world, complicated business problems just using mathematics and data. So it sort of started from there. And that was sort of opened my mind to it. And then then I spent about a decade in management consulting, working in lots and lots of different industries. And that was really just solving hard problems one at a time, really, just going at it. But then when I flipped into the tech business, first into Skype, as I say, and then into others, then I got a little bit more on a track, as you say. Then I've been a bit more kind of honing my craft, and I've got a bit more of a consistent point of view about what works, what doesn't work, about how to, basically how to extract value out of data. That's ultimately the thing. During that first decade, the first sort of big data, revolution happened and companies started collecting large quantities of data, like lots of companies, before they even knew what to do with it, really, during that decade of the first 2000s. So that was more of a period of discovery, I guess, for everybody involved. But then, more recently, since the mobile internet has taken over and there's been much more sort of established competition, I suppose, between consumer apps, between competition for attention, between competition for, writing efficient mobile apps that drive loyalty and drive retention and ultimately create value in a competitive space, which it is, then increasingly, having a very mature lens on what your data operation is doing and how you connect that to your product strategy, your engineering strategy is critical for success, really. And some of those big companies, notably Facebook, I felt had worked out how to do that. They'd solved that quite early on in their journey as a company. So data was really tightly integrated with what they did. And it struck me as, no surprise, really, that they achieved the incredible growth that they did over that time period, because they'd sort of cracked the code of how to get data and product, like driving really well together and really tightly together.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting journey, that, because as you say, you start off, solving one problem at a time and going, here's a problem, I'm going to solve it, and I'm going to use maths because that's my expertise, that's my area of choice. And in some ways now I see lots of people trying to do it the other way around. It's like, I've got some AI, what do I do with it? And I think that kind of almost back to basics kind of mentality of, we're just trying to run a business here. What are the things we need to do, and what are the tools we can use to help us do that better? And that I'm sure plays a part in the journey that you just talked through.
Totally, yes, exactly. I've sort of always felt that way. And as I say, I was heartened when I went to Facebook and discovered that, when they were hiring lots of data scientists out in Silicon Valley, because I started off looking at what they were doing over there in order to bring that model over to London. And I was encouraged that when I went over there, they literally had a part of the interview loop was to test for pragmatism. So they would reject candidates sometimes that were very academically capable, but they just didn't have that pragmatic mindset, which is like, no, we're solving a problem. And in a way, their whole philosophy was about rewarding impact, and impact comes from solving a valuable problem. They didn't really reward complexity, if you see what I mean. You don't, as an individual, data scientist, and the same, by the way, if you're an engineer or a product person, or, most of the roles work this way. It's like you've got credit for the outcome. And the idea was that there were smart enough people, you would pick whatever tool was the right tool off the shelf and use it. You didn't get much credit for doing something that seemed complicated. You did it for kind of creating value. And if you could do that in a simple way, then great, like go for it.
Yeah.
That was the whole system.
Even better, yeah.
Devise that.
Yeah, I like that. So let's talk about trains.
Yes.
Let's talk about trains. So the rail industry, yes, my personal experience of the rail industry is purely as a consumer, a user of trains, getting on them, getting off them, paying for them, and getting mightily frustrated most of the time, I'm sure.
Yes.
But come on, talk to me about like the industry as a whole, and sort of what's changed over the last, 10 years. Like, how's it different? And I suppose with the lens of what digital has done to help it, because that's the space that obviously that you're in.
Yeah, yes, for sure. So just to be clear, I've been in this role at Trainline for just over a couple of years now.
Okay.
But Trainline's obviously not a new company. It's just crossed its 25-year anniversary.
Wow.
And it's selling train tickets in the UK for a long time, pioneered a lot of the digital barcode format in the UK, which has really taken off. And then in the last few years, our secondary big focus has been expanding into Europe. So a lot of people in the UK know Trainline in the UK, but now we operate in France, Italy, Spain, and lots of other countries beyond there as well. And our plan is really to start to try and, create like a joined up experience, if you like, across all the different rail companies around Europe. So we integrate with just over 270 different rail operators in different countries. And therein lies the complexity. But one of the things about the rail industry that I've learned, like I say, I came into this industry a couple of years ago thinking maybe like a lot of people on the outside, well, how hard can it be selling train tickets? It doesn't sound as hard as, I don't know, policing the content of WhatsApp or something that we were. But it turns out selling train tickets digitally is quite hard, partly because it's a really old industry. So because of that, a lot of those many hundreds of different train companies all have different systems, different ticket rules, different kind of fare classes, price points, rules about when you can and can't travel, rules about whether you could take a child, whether you could take a bike, whether you need a seat reservation, whether you need to provide your email address or not, and so on. So it's a surprisingly complicated landscape. And one of the goals of Trainline is to just try and provide this very modern, travel companion experience that just abstracts all that away and floats on top of it. So a lot of the journey, if you like, that Trainline's been on over that period is kind of building out all of that complexity into its technical stack, and then also doing its best to hide all of that complexity to the end user, make it seem incredibly simple and attractive in terms of how you get on. But in terms of your question, like what's changing in the rail industry? Well, yes, few things really. I think in the UK, as you say, it's gone on this very big journey around digitalization in the last decade. There's been questions for the last several years about how the future of UK rail is going to operate, because you've got this model where you've got different train companies that operate regionally, and various different government groups and industry bodies have taken a crack at saying how should that evolve for the future, if you like, how should that go, which is interesting. But the other big change, if we look to Europe, if you look at what's happening in Spain and France and Italy, something really interesting is happening in the last few years. They've long had this promise in the EU of the open track concept, which is basically the idea of trying to increase competition between rail carriers. So they've changed the legislation so that, they've sort of separated the track from the operator. And what that means is different operators can come in and run trains on the same track. And in the last few years, we're really starting to see that take off, and it's really started to become real. The most advanced example we have of that is if you're in Barcelona going to Madrid, then there are 4 different rail companies that you can buy a ticket from, which operate on exactly the same track, going Barcelona to Madrid. And they all have price points. They all try and compete on, service level and on experience. And this has really started to drive up demand and really create this sort of healthy competition, very similar to what happened with airlines, over the last couple of decades, where you've got, incumbent airline operators and then low cost providers and, increasingly everything in between, where, there's this competition going on. So you're starting to see the same thing happening in rail. It's taken off in Spain. On that route I mentioned, over the last few years, the competition has started to see the prices come down, which is, if you're a Brit who travels by train, that's a radical thought, right? Prices only go up in the UK.
Yeah, they do.
But they've come down by 50% in Spain on average over the last couple of years on that route. The average ticket price that we sell now is half of what it was a couple of years ago. And as a result, volume is going up, which is awesome. And so at the top end, business people are deciding to fly less between those two locations and take the train. And at the kind of student type end or the younger person's end, there used to be a lot of coach travel, and that is also moving to train, which is a good thing because train is a much lower carbon emitter for that kind of route versus flying or driving.
And is that something that can happen here? I sort of feel it's a different setup here in that you've already got trains that are pretty full, and as you say, prices are going up. So in some ways, it's not really the incentive to do anything because you've already got, people have to use the network and they do use it. And all you do as a consumer is just sort of suck it up, or as when COVID hit, you stop using it completely. But there's no sort of almost nothing in between.
Right, exactly, and it does need something more structural, I think, to make that work in the UK. There are a couple of examples, though. If you go London to Edinburgh now, there is a new train company called Lumo, who operates on the same track. So you can take LNER, which is the traditional operator between that goes up the East Coast main line. But there's now Lumo, which is a new operator that just specifically runs London to Edinburgh at a lower price point, trying to, if you like, be a little bit more like the Ryanair of that route.
I actually wish I knew that. I've just booked the train to Edinburgh on LNER.
Well, give them a try. Go up on one, go back on the other.
Just hold the line, please, caller. I'm just going to change my my booking.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is so there's obviously, without going into the full detail of the sort of train network and how it works, but there is therefore some complexity, certainly globally, in the areas that you operate in. There are some cultural and sort of infrastructure challenges which you don't control or necessarily even influence, but do try and provide a service on top of, as you say, to simplify the complexity that exists in spite of the complexity. So what kind of challenges does that kind of given you Trainline, and obviously you as you've come into this new role, and where does digital and data and AI play a part in that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that has struck me since coming into the rail industry, especially compared with some of those industries I've been working in before, is that it strikes me that the rail industry doesn't really know its customer very well.
Right.
By which I mean, the rail industry knows how many tickets it's sold, and it kind of, it knows how many people it moves between, London and York every week, approximately. But when you dig a bit deeper, it doesn't necessarily understand the patterns, the desires, and how people's travel needs.
The missions.
Yeah, it's kind of like the behavioral stuff, like a click deeper. Like, how many of those people going London to York take that journey every week? And how many of them take it 3 times a week? How many of them take it once a year? And how many of them are traveling with their family? How many of them are a business traveler who is looking for convenience, not necessarily, who's maybe less price sensitive than someone who's very price sensitive and is only going to travel, when the maximum discount's available, and so on. It's kind of like getting into really understanding what drives your customer behavior, what they need, and therefore how to show up as a service. I feel like there's a real opportunity now. There's a great debate now in the UK rail industry about what the future needs to look like and how it needs to modernize and evolve. And I think it starts with that. I think it starts with really understanding the passenger, understanding the user, and taking a modern view of user behavioral data in the way that I'm, trying to build out at Trainline strikes me as the way to do that. Because it's, as I say, I'm not inventing the wheel here. It's these other industries are well established in terms of patterns of thinking about it. So I think it starts off there, where you start to obsess about patterns of behavior and habits over time. It's that's the real way to start to unlock how to understand any business, I think, and then a consumer business anyway, and then how to develop strategies for growth. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Rail is very keen to grow in the UK, despite the fact that there are, you can often find yourself on a crowded train again now, few years, however many years after COVID we are. As a total network, it's still not fully recovered. So there is additional capacity still on the whole network, and people's travel patterns have changed completely, of course. So one of the big things, as someone who's been into, behavioral data science for quite a long period of time, you're used to seeing small changes, incremental 1% changes in the behavior of a population or a set of people, right? So COVID was extraordinary because, especially when it comes to travel, completely changed everyone's behavior all at once, almost, which was a pretty radical thing. And I think the dust is still settling on that. But industries like rail, probably do need to adapt all sorts of things, like when do they put certain trains on, what capacity at what time of day and week. Do we need an on-peak, off-peak rule like we have in the UK in the same way? And does it make sense to have it at the same time? Lots of those sort of rules and ticketing rules were set up.
Quite blunt instrument, really, aren't they? It's sort of quite binary. It's this, it's that, it's this price, it's that price. It's sort of a little bit kind of like black and white. And actually, but it's not interestingly, it's not black and white for the customer. It's actually quite a confusing mix of, well, when's the best place to travel, and should I have done this route slightly differently? Could I have got it, a better rate if I, added a child to the ad? Do you know what I mean? It's quite confusing to travel in terms of what's the best makeup of train and price and time.
Yes, it is. Exactly. It exactly is at the moment, especially, there's so many different factors that go into how the thing works. And to some extent, some of the things that we try and do is try and create value for people through that. So if you buy like a split save ticket, for example, on Trainline, which you sometimes get offered, that's one of our algorithms trying to work out if I can, instead of buying you a ticket from A to B, I can break it into 2 or 3 subcomponents. Then sometimes those subcomponents are cheaper than buying the original A to B.
Right.
If you know what I mean. Which is just a sort of an anomaly which comes from the complexity of the rules in the first place. So
and so just sort of going back to how this sort of data and AI supports all of this. So as you say, understanding customer sounds like your bread and butter, and certainly these kind of companies you've come from are certainly obsessed in that way. And I imagine you're bringing some of that obsession to Trainline. Once you've got an understanding of that, what does that allow you to do? What can you do? What can you change? What can you improve for either Trainline or the customer, or hopefully both?
Yeah, I think 2 things. I think it's possible to create value in both directions, as you say. So part of that is trying to understand people's needs and desires and really try and create value for the traveling customer. So I mentioned split save, but there's all sorts of other ways in which the search engine is a lot more nuanced than it seems under the surface, where we're trying to surface the cheapest possible ticket to get from A to B in the most efficient way. And I think there's more and more as we get into developing machine learning and increasingly AI type solutions in that space. There's more smart things that we can do that help out the end user. So as an example, one of the things we're working on at the moment is like a price prediction algorithm. So if you're looking for a train and you're thinking of buying a ticket in advance, then we can start to predict how long that price is going to stay valid for and when the price might change. You see what I mean?
Right.
So to your point, the rules around that are complicated, and so having an ML predictor model could be quite a valuable thing. But equally, I mean, the other thing I'm quite mindful of as well is that I think there's you almost think of a Venn diagram when you're thinking about trying to create value out of all of this data and understanding, and part of it is value for the user, but the other part is I think value for all our partners, for the rest of the industry. So increasingly what we're also doing is developing data products which can be shared with the rest of the rail industry and also with decision makers like Department for Transport and elements of government and so on. So we can start to bring some of this stuff alive for them, so they can start to see the opportunities and start to see, where does it make sense to think about, redesigning the way the service works or the price points and so on in response to what people want and need. So we think we do, increasingly we have a role to help sort of influence policy, if you like, and influence those strategic decisions about how the thing is set up, which I think is quite interesting. I think we're really, at the early stages of that, but it's quite a lot more that can be done there. One interesting example, by the way, is that we've recently we've produced a data set which internally we call Reasonable by Rail, which seeks to work out for every route across the network how reasonable it is for an end user to choose to go by rail. Because our mission is to try and get as many people as possible to pick rail as their way of travel, mostly because of the green agenda that sits behind that and the sustainability benefits that you get by taking those trips by rail. But what we've tried to do is compare almost the convenience and the cost differential of traveling by rail on a particular route versus driving or flying on that same route. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Crunch that data across the whole of the UK, across thousands and thousands of different, origin destination combinations. And it's interesting both ways, right? Because if you look at the top of the list, you get the routes that are most reasonable by rail. And I think that gives us a great opportunity to market those more, to shout about that more to the consumer, and to really make that case that, look, not only is it a good thing to do, but also it's going to save you money and it's faster.
Yeah, it's quicker, faster, cheaper, and more green. Why wouldn't you? Yeah.
Not exactly. Yeah. but your question, I think, if you look at the other end of the table, like look at the routes which are least favourable at the moment. And I think that's the conversation that we can then take to government and to policymakers to say, well, look, we should do something about these parts of the network, because, you can't expect people to choose it if it's more expensive and takes longer, essentially.
Yeah.
So I think, like I say, I think our role is to hopefully try and have impact in both directions.
Yeah. And you talk about sort of projects you're working on. It has data or basic analytics and or advanced analytics and or AI machine learning, sort of that full, I suppose, spectrum of types of use of data or technologies around it. Has that just now coming to sort of effect, or has that been at play for a while at Trainline? Yeah,
it's been at play for quite a while at Trainline. As I mentioned earlier, I see it as an incremental approach, really. I think Trainline's been building some ML-based features into its stack for a while. So, I mentioned Split Save's been around for quite a while, and there've been other things. I think early in the pandemic there was a great feature around trying to predict how busy the train would be and which carriages would be most busy, that kind of thing, to try and help people, especially when they were in that mode of trying to, avoid crowded situations. So, yeah, things like that, those sorts of core ML features have been around for a while. What we're doing right now is I'm really starting to experiment with generative AI and everything that's happened in the last year and work out how we can apply that into travel. And I think look, it's early days, right, for all of us in that field. But I'm really excited.
You having a play already, though?
Oh yeah, definitely. I definitely believe the best way to find out about these things is to just start doing it. So we've actually created a little AI lab team inside of the data org with cross-functional team with some front-end engineering, some back-end engineering, and some more traditional ML data science in a little squad. And we're starting to experiment with how can we, take advantage of all this stuff. I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is how quickly that technology has become commoditized in a really short space of time. Yeah. I mean, following AI, then, we probably would have got to the point of where we're at now with large language models at some point, but it got there pretty fast. And then right after that, it became commoditized. That's the thing. Like the speed with which the open source world picked it up and ran meant that, I think it's now quite practical for mid-sized tech companies like Trainline to be, deploying language models, fine-tuning them inside their own environment, building in context from our own data sets and so on. And I think all of that becomes super interesting. Like, obviously, it's unlikely that as Trainline, you're not going to build a new foundational model. That's going to be left to specialist companies and the big tech companies with access to the supercomputers. But it's surprising how quickly, I think, for a company that wants to build practical solutions into their products, you don't necessarily need to do that. There's a lot you can do by starting to take these different sized models off the shelf and then start to embellish them with your own data. Because, that's when it gets valuable, right? You could take a general purpose language model, like, for example, we've been experimenting with some of the Llama 2 models that came out of Meta earlier this year. But what we've got in our data set is obviously quite a unique set of information, because we've got a lot of detailed domain data about how the railway works. So we understand ticket rules, timetables, prices, real-time disruption information, platform information, you name it, from pretty much every part of the rail network across Europe. But then we've also got, as we've been talking about, this deep, user behavioral data set. Like, how do people use that network? Where do they travel to? What do they search for before they travel? What do they search for and then not travel, for example? And you start to see there's all the statistics that go with that. And so if you can start to take advantage of these new language models and then connect them with those unique data sets, and then in turn also hook them up to your APIs so that they can start to act as an agent for you and get things done. Like, the whole agency model is super interesting. Then there's a path to something I think really interesting, and I think that takes us to a space where we can potentially start to, lean into real consumer customer problems that are much more kind of open-ended, complicated problems that typically we wouldn't have probably tried to solve using traditional methods, because it would just be kind of not worth it, if you see what I mean. So I think travel's full of things like that. If you know where you want to go with a travel app, then you can open a website or a travel app and search A to B and get your results, if you see what I mean. But I mean, take an example. Let's say you live in Boston and you want to come to Europe for a once in a lifetime rail trip around Europe with your family next summer. And there's an increasing number of those folks, by the way, that we're starting to see do that, where they fly into Europe and they kind of do a grand tour of, many countries by rail back, which sounds awesome. But, planning that and coordinating that is supremely complicated. Like,
it is, yeah.
No understanding of the network, multiple tickets at once, different operators, different timetables. What are you optimizing for when? So a traditional travel app is not necessarily going to help you with that. And frankly, I mean, that's why travel agents still exist, right? Because you
need someone who understands it all. Yeah.
You might go talk to an expert at that point. That is a feasible thing. But I think that's the sort of space that you could imagine us being able to offer, AI powered solutions, which would actually help you plan and customize a trip, for instance, and maybe be able to change. What if you want to change leg 4 of a 10-leg trip? Suddenly it's pretty complicated, right? So I think things like that are pretty exciting. And then the other example, if you take an example at the other end of the spectrum, that's a sort of big trip planning in the future. The other example is, what you mentioned at the start of the call, your daily commute is still a period of time fraught with complexity and challenge. Especially if you're kind of getting in and out of a big metropolitan area like London. Loads of options. What are your chances of the train you're on being held up or late?
Yeah.
Should you stick on this train? Should you get off and take a different one? Should you walk to a different platform? Should you even go to a different station?
Yeah.
Because it's quicker in total. Is your ticket going to be valid if you do? All that stuff. So I think it's exciting because I think we're going to be able to start to tackle complexity like that, in a way that with a traditional product, you just kind of wouldn't get to, because it's the complexity versus reward just doesn't quite stack up.
Yeah. But it can get you there a bit quicker, can't it? And I suppose a more elegant front end for the person who's interacting with it. I think that's the critical thing that makes it works, doesn't it? Because I think in your example of the complex trip, at the moment, probably you'd need a call center for someone to call up and say, can you just help me plan out this trip, please? And then I'll book all the tickets, or you can do it for me. But that feels like cost and scale. Whereas actually, I think you can almost skip that part and jump straight to being able to kind of say, look, I'm trying to get here. Give me the 3-4 best options that you've got and rough pricing for each of them. Great. Now at least I've got a starting point to plan my trip, even if it's one trip into London from, the suburbs. It doesn't have to be a complex trip, does it?
No, exactly. And, one of the things I think, one of the interesting questions I think that we're all as an industry grappling with right now is like, let's assume that, LLMs are widely available, the technology is solved, and it can access all your data. Okay, great. So that is not all solved yet, but let's assume that is solved. One of the next challenges after that, I think, is how do you integrate and show up these AI capabilities inside of a traditional UI? There's a really interesting UI/AI debate, if you like, because the things that have taken off most widely and blown everyone's mind in the last year is things like ChatGPT, which is a natural chat interface. And for some situations, a chat interface might be the right one, might be very valuable. So, maybe that 5-leg massive trip planning problem is something you just want to chat to in natural language, maybe. But do you want to organize your daily commute through natural language? It's like, almost certainly not.
No.
Like, you don't want to be going on a chatbot going, okay, do I catch the 8:23 from school? It's like, that's a worse experience, right? What you want is like one click in those situations. You want an app which is smart enough to know where you are, what you're trying to do, and the minimum number of clicks possible, and the fastest route to the right information is the thing that matters to you. And, in that sense, I still think there's an interesting role for a lot of these new AI technologies, but they're probably one click behind the scenes, actually. Like, they're not necessarily a chatbot in your face, but you might just feel it through just having a smarter app, which is still using a, traditional user interface and buttons and things, but it might just have the right button because it's already worked it out, So things like that.
I feel there's going to be a new feature released in Trainline, and it's just going to be called the right button. I really want that feature, please.
That's my dream.
That's the dream. The right button.
The one button app.
Yeah, it just knows where you're traveling, what time you need to get there, and how much you're willing to pay, and it just does it for you. I love that.
It's got one big button on the screen that says "buy train."
That's just probably where and ironically, that's probably, it's full circle. It's probably where Trainline started.
Yeah, probably.
It's got more complex. So I just to kind of finish up, I wouldn't mind just exploring a little bit, because that's all been brilliant. I love, obviously you've got a lot of stuff you've done, a lot of stuff that you're just working out on, some brilliant ideas. So I can see how this is an exciting role. And so through the lens of that role, right? You're chief data officer. You're in essentially a tech company, digital tech business. You've got that kind of background in terms of where you've been before. What's the relationship, I suppose, with you and the rest of your exec, your leadership team, your peers? Because, data is one of those things that's a bit kind of can be a bit toe tready. Are you serving data to product? Are you doing technology? Are you, how do you exist within the business, and how do you work together and collaborate with your peers so that it all works nicely, or not, as the case may be, depending on what you say?
That's a great question, actually. When I joined Trainline, the role of data there was much more as a sort of service to the rest of the business, if you see what I mean. But honestly, I think that's why they, that was part of the plan for creating a chief data officer role, so that you've got a fully fledged member of the exec team who's bringing that data skill set with them, but they're actually a fully fledged member, a peer group with all the other execs. And it makes a huge difference. Having worked in now a lot of organizations that do this differently, I do think having for the right type of business, having a fully fledged, executive role is a very powerful thing. One of the things I remember when I first went to, if I wind the clock back, and when I first went to Facebook, or Meta as it now is, then the culture there was just naturally very data driven, if you see what I mean. So part of the philosophy there was that all the way down through the teams, you had sort of data people embedded in nearly all of the product teams all the way down. The theory went that you had this, what was it? It was called the three-legged stool, or the four-legged stool model. This is going back in my memory a bit. So the idea is that every sort of product squad would have a product leader, an engineering leader, a designer, and a data scientist. And the idea was that in theory, that was a peer group, and they collectively took decisions about what their particular area of the product was going to do, or how they were going to hit their goal, basically. And if you scale that up, then at each level of leadership through the organization, you still had this sort of peer setup, pretty much all the way to the top, where you have very senior people representing the data function sat at the very top of the business. And that created a culture all the way through, where data wasn't a thing that people asked for, but the data people were at the table, driving decisions, contributing strategy, coming up with a comment, sometimes challenging other people around the table, sometimes encouraging them, sometimes spotting problems, sometimes trying to, bring solutions and value creation. So it feels quite natural the way that's now working at Trainline. In my current role, it feels exactly that. On the one hand, I'm representing the data organization and what we can do with it. But on the other hand, I'm really sharing, collective responsibility for running the company, basically, with everybody else. And I think that's a very progressive, way to. You get a lot more. Not only can your data contribute more because it's right in those conversations, but you start doing smarter things with your data assets because all of that context flows the other way as well. If you see what I mean, you're not. The great danger is, and with complete respect to all of my former colleagues over the decades, if you allow sort of lots of non-data people to just ask questions of your data team, and that's the primary interaction, then quite a lot of the time the question isn't necessarily going to be quite the right question to ask necessarily.
Yeah.
And then the data team is going to do lots of useful work, but not necessarily the most strategic work that they could be doing. You know what I mean? So really working out how to create your data organization as a strategic asset, which is driving the company forwards, not a kind of customer service type relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting sort of nail on the head for me, actually, in terms of the CDO role being strategic. That wasn't particularly where I started this question, but I think it allows you to focus on the most strategic things. And those strategic things could be fixed operational things, but they're still strategic things that are most important. Otherwise, as you say, you're at the other end of just serving the noise, and the noise might not be the most strategic thing. And so who are your peers? Who are you sat at the table with? And is there, do you have really clear delineation of responsibility, or actually is that sort of bit of grayness and a bit of collaboration in the middle, like enabling rather than sort of toe tready, as I called it before?
Yeah, it's a pretty healthy dynamic that we have at Trainline. There was quite a bit of change around the exec team about 3 years ago, because there was a new CEO in the chair, Jamie Ford, who came from eBay and Photobox and Moonpig, and so various other sort of digital technology companies. And then he brought in quite a few people with strong technology and product background. So as myself, came out of Facebook. My colleague Milena, who's the CTO, came out of Google. Dave Price, the chief product officer, came out of Omeo in travel, but then before that Spotify. So there's deep background. The chief commercial officer is ex eBay as well. So there's this sort of deep background of like tech and product and how all that works together. It works quite well. So we each sort of play different role around the table. And there is a certain amount of collaboration between the CTO, like technology, product, and data kind of operate some extent together, because they're all the people who are basically building stuff. And then we have a lot of our operations, our marketing and our commercial stuff rolls up under our chief commercial officer, Pete Wade. And so there's the kind of operational machine that's kind of running and trading the business every day, every week, because, ultimately we're a retailer. So you have to, there's a high pace of operation that goes on as well. Yeah, but there's a healthy, and the data supports both as well. I mean, that's the other thing I was about to say, is that in a product company, then where to put data. So yes, there's a deep requirement. I've spoken a lot about data driving product and driving the technology that you build, but increasingly the other very important arm for not just having the data, but a lot of the advanced ML AI stuff we're talking about also is getting smarter at marketing. So the other huge area that I think data needs to connect with is like the modern marketing organization, particularly now as marketing's really going through a bit of a transformation at the moment. The world of digital marketing is changing quite a lot with all of the post GDPR, with all of the cookie blocking stuff that came from Apple in the last couple of years and others, has meant that a lot of the methods and approaches of doing digital marketing at scale has, the things that used to work don't work anymore, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Whether you're an advertiser or you're a company running an ads platform, as I was in the last gig, there's a lot of change going on right now, and people need to reinvent and a lot of that change, a lot of the challenge that comes with that change. Part of the answer to that is deploying, the latest in AI, the latest in ML, to try and create signals where you don't have signals anymore, create inference where you don't have it, anymore. Things like predicting dynamic yield curves, working out multi-touch attribution models. Like all of these things are, I guess a lot of people in digital marketing over the last 10 years, it was felt that, yeah, these things are fairly well understood and solved. And it feels right now as if they're kind of broken again. And we're sort of solved, and a lot of people in different industries are trying to solve them all over again. So that's an interesting space. And I just wanted to shout it out because I'm feeling that sort of reflected. You were asking about my role and the dynamics between the other execs. So yeah, it's an increasingly important role between the CDO and the CMO, the chief marketing officer or chief commercial officer, as it is at Trainline, because that, again, thinking strategically about how do you put the right tools and infrastructure in place to drive modern marketing is I think a big challenge for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, no, indeed. And, some good juicy use cases, either solving stuff that's already been solved and of course solving new problems that we didn't know existed until more recently. So thank you for sharing that little insight into your leadership, but also more broadly about what you guys are up to in Trainline and the industry sort of more broadly. Trains, but digital on top of that, and really using data at the heart of it is hugely fascinating. So thank you for coming on the show and sharing that.
Oh, thanks, Jason. It's been a lot of fun. Exactly, and the journey continues.
It does, and I'm sure there's a pun there every minute of journeys and driving change and
staying on track.
Yeah,
don't get me started.
Yeah. So on those pun bombshells, we shall call it a day. And as I say, thanks very much, Mike, and thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and the conversation as much as I did, and we'll catch you again soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Hub and Spoken podcast. Don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our newsletter at hubandspoken.com. Plus tell your peers, colleagues and friends about the show so they can join the fun also. Bye for now.